Okay, so today we're happy to have Ruth Angus with us. She's a grad student at Oxford, and she just finished a year as a pre-doc at Harvard. I think she'll be heading back soon to finish up. She is very interested in stellar variability and figuring out stellar ages, and has been applying some sophisticated statistical techniques to these problems that I think we'll get to hear some about today. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So I'm talking about both stellar ages and stellar rotation today. They're related. So I'm going to talk about stellar rotation in the context of inferring ages from stellar rotation periods. But this is sort of a talk of two halves, really. So the first half, I'll talk about stellar ages, gyrochronology, using rotation periods to infer ages. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about some methods that I've developed to actually measure stellar rotation periods, and ways in which we can use those rotation periods to help calibrate gyrochronology. Okay, so I'm also going to talk about the K2 mission, which I'll describe when I get there. But first of all, let me just introduce gyrochronology and talk about some problems that we're maybe facing with gyrochronology at the moment. So this kind of, is all really about stellar ages. And there are a variety of reasons why I'm interested in stellar ages, but predominantly it's from an exoplanet point of view. And I'm interested in studying the way that exoplanet systems evolve over time. The problem is stellar ages are really difficult to measure, especially for stars on the main sequence. They don't change very much. So the methods that we have available for measuring stellar ages tend to produce quite large uncertainties. The most kind of common method for measuring a stellar age is to get a high-resolution spectrum of your star, infer the effective temperature, the log G, the metallicity, and then fit an isochrone to your star. If you're really lucky, your star might be in a cluster, and then you can use the fact that you have an ensemble of stars and get a really precise age on the age of that cluster. And so you can actually measure stellar ages with a precision of about 10% if they're in a cluster. Unfortunately, of course, most stars are not in clusters. And for field stars, isochrone fitting is still kind of pretty much the standard way to infer an age. But for a field star, you're looking at an uncertainty of 50% minimum, probably more often 100%, sometimes even 150%. So these are pretty imprecise ages. And we can do better than this for field stars. So since the launch of the Kepler mission, and the CoRoT mission as well, we've been able to use Asteroseismology to infer the fundamental parameters of stars. So for solar-like stars, you can use Kepler short cadence data. So these are data that are taken every minute. And you can produce a power spectrum of your light curve of a star. If you have high enough signal to noise, you might produce a power spectrum that looks a bit like this. And there are two ways that you can infer an age from one of these power spectra. You can either, in the highest signal to noise cases, measure the positions of these peaks in frequency. So you can measure the frequency of each one of those peaks. And each one of those peaks is produced by a different oscillation mode in the star. And each oscillation mode probes a different depth in the star. So measuring the frequency of these peaks tells you about the integrated sound speed along the path through the star, which tells you about the density. And you can build up a density profile, and you can compare that density profile with a theoretical model and infer an age. That's the best case scenario. We can do that for about 100 stars total. But for the majority of these asteroseismic solar-like stars, you can't actually measure the individual frequencies. You can just measure a frequency separation, delta nu. And that tells you about the bulk density of your star. which you can still use to infer an age, but that age will have a lower precision. And a typical uncertainty will be around 50%. So asteroseismology can be very powerful, can give us very precise ages, but it can't give us very precise ages for very many stars, just like in the case of the clusters. So we can use asteroseismology and we can use cluster stars to calibrate alternative dating methods, which will be applicable to many, many more stars, as long as they're calibrated. One such method is gyrochronology. Gyrochronology really has the potential to be incredibly powerful for precisely the reason that all you need to infer an age is a rotation period and a mass or a mass proxy, so color. And we have these things in hand already, or they're very easy to measure for almost every single star observed by Kepler, and every single star that will be observed by K2 and TESS and Plato and all these upcoming missions. So how does gyrochronology work? Well, the idea is that as stars sit on the main sequence, they slowly lose angular momentum via their magnetized wind, which co-rotates with the surface of the star out to the Alfvén radius, at which point it decouples, and angular momentum is lost from the system. So stars spin down slowly over their main sequence lifetimes in a way that's related to their mass. So you might wonder, why can you measure a rotation period of a star today and infer its evolution up until this point? Well, this is the reason. So this is equatorial velocity versus time, and these are theoretical models. And basically what this is showing is that before a star hits the main sequence, it's still contracting, it's spinning up. That's what's happening up till this point. Once it hits the main sequence, it starts to lose angular momentum. And because the angular momentum loss rate is related to the magnetic dynamo, and that magnetic dynamo is generated by rotation, these things are interlinked, and there's a feedback cycle. So what ends up happening is the most rapidly rotating stars shed angular momentum really fast. The least rapidly rotating stars shed angular momentum more slowly. And by around 500 million years, they've converged onto a single, a unique sequence, a single relation between period, mass, and age. So that is the kind of idea of gyrochronology. All you need is the current rotation period, and you don't need to know what initial rotation period the star had. So there are kind of two approaches that you might take to gyrochronology. You might use these angular momentum loss models and model the physics. These models, although they're sort of based on theory, they're very often still calibrated to the sun, so they're not completely independent of observations. And then another approach is a purely empirical one. And that is the approach that I will be talking about today, because the really nice thing about the purely empirical gyrochronology relations is exactly what I've said before. All you need is a rotation period and a color. And if you only know those two things about a star, we still need to be able to infer an age. We don't want to be model dependent. So we don't want to have to assume some kind of model to infer a mass or a radius for the star. We just want to use what we've got observationally. So this is the sort of standard form for the empirical gyrochronology relation here. And it describes this plane. This is the rotation age color plane. And before Kepler, this plane was calibrated using only young cluster stars, shown here in blue, and the sun. So the relation between rotation period and color came from the clusters, and the only age calibrator was the sun. So the only age information came from the sun. But with Kepler, we've now got asteroseismic targets, which have a range of ages. And so for the first time, we were actually able to place down these asteroseismic stars on this plane and calibrate it more thoroughly. So I said at the beginning that there were 500 solar-like stars observed by Kepler with short cadence data. However, only 300 of those stars had rotation period measurements. And of those, not all of them were the right temperature. So if your star is hotter than about 6,250 Kelvin, if it's hotter than the Kraft break, then it won't have a very deep convection zone and it won't spin down in the same way. So this is only applicable to FGK stars. And of those remaining cool stars, some of them were subgiants. So in fact, what started out as quite a large sample ended up being quite a small one, and we only had of order 30 stars to work with in the end. However, what we did do was to take we didn't take cuts. We never made these cuts in log G or effective temperature saying these stars are definitely subgiants or these stars are definitely hot stars that don't spin down. We modeled all of the population at once at the same time because the uncertainties in our parameters are quite large and each star has some probability mass lying in every regime. So that was an important part of our analysis. Okay, in my next slide, I'm going to show you this slice through this plane. So stars at solar color over a range of ages and rotation periods. So this is rotation period versus age, now on a log-log scale, so it's a straight line. These stars here are the young cluster stars, and these stars here are the older field stars. The red star is the sun. The blue stars are local field stars with quite precise parameters. And then the black stars are the Kepler Asteroseismic field stars. And I'm also showing some models there. The two cyan lines show previous models. The black line shows the model that we fit to the data. And the first thing I'll say about this plot is that obviously these models go through the sun. The cyan models were calibrated using only the sun, but our black line also goes through the sun. And that's because the sun and the local field stars have such small uncertainties that they really anchor this relation to them. However, the Kepler asteroseismic stars are all pretty much lying below that line of best fit. So it's clear that the sun and the local field stars follow this relation. And it was really the sun and the local field stars that led us to believe that these relations hold for all stars. But for the first time, we've got this new data, and we're able to see that, for a large ensemble of stars, perhaps this isn't working the way we thought it was. The grey lines, by the way, the faint grey lines, are draws from the posterior probability distributions of the gyrochronological parameters. So what they're showing is that the posteriors of these parameters are bimodal. And one of the modes is this mode described by the sun, and the other mode is the mode that goes through the center of the Kepler population. So there's clearly a little bit of a mystery here, and there are a few different plausible explanations, I think, for what's going on. Yeah. The solid black line is the highest likelihood sample we saw. So the first potential cause is that we need a new gyrochronology relation. And one sort of relation that you might imagine working for these stars is that perhaps at some age, stars the magnetic dynamo changes form slightly, or the rotational response to the magnetic dynamo changes and stars starts losing angular momentum more slowly. That could explain the data. Possibly, alternatively, there's actually a large spread in rotation periods for a given color and age. I think that's very plausible. Yes.
I'm just curious, the Kepler stars, those were calculated from Asteroseismology?
The ages are from Asteroseismology. The rotation periods are measured from the Kepler light curves. And I'll talk a bit more about that later.
Surely you have more information form of Gaussian line diagonals, etc.
Yeah.
Measurements that would let you, estimate the level of magnetic activity.
Yeah. So what we definitely do have for these stars is not necessarily activity diagnostics, but we do have some more information for some of them. So we certainly know metallicities for some of these stars. And actually, more sophisticated gyrochronology models do use metallicities. And if you include metallicity in your model, you'll see a reduced scatter. So the spread will decrease a bit, but you still see an offset.
So and that is because that curvature would be that one will still depends on that velocity.
It's partly to do with the color. Metallicity will affect the color for a given mass. But it's also partly because metallicity affects the internal profile of the star, which will in turn affect the magnetic dynamo. However, we chose not to use metallicity in this empirical relation, mainly because metallicity is a parameter that can be hard to come by for a lot of Kepler stars and a lot of K2 stars. So we tried to stay independent of any additional parameters if we could. But rest assured that models that do take metallicity into account, there is still this effect. You still see this effect, this offset. So it doesn't explain it.
So also when it's using P minus V is observable in that sensitivity, but it's really a combination of mass,
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
So are these ones the ones which are offline? Do they have different masses, for example, than the sun?
These stars. So
Or is it systematic trending mass?
So yeah, there is a little bit of a width here, but it's there is some scatter about the mass of the sun, but it's not systematic. It's not a systematic offset. So you're right in that using color is not a perfect approximation for a mass.
So you should expect to see a dispersion.
Yes, absolutely you would. But again, this effect is still seen in by studies that do actually model masses and not colors.
So this is not systematic lower mass or higher mass?
It's not systematic.
Why do you get such precise gauges for two of the Kepler stars and not for any of the others?
Because these are the stars, do you remember I said earlier that for asteroseismic stars you can either measure individual frequencies or the mean frequency separation? These stars are stars with individual frequency modes. So they've had their stellar density profile measured rather than like a boutique modeling, yes. So these stars are from Travis Metcalf's paper, and the others are from the Bill Chaplin sample. Okay, so perhaps there is some dispersion in these relations. I think that's incredibly likely. It's not necessarily expected, but I think it's definitely a good candidate for what we're seeing here. And what might be happening is that there is a broad range of rotation periods for a given color and age. And because with Kepler data, with Kepler photometric periods, we're only sensitive to a certain rotation period. And beyond that, we actually can't measure rotation periods. And that happens at around 50 or 60 days. So that could explain what's going on here. So if we're completely incomplete, insensitive to rotation periods up here, then that might produce what we're seeing. That's really pretty straightforward to test, actually. We can just inject rotation periods into Kepler-like curves, use the same detrending methods that they do, and see what we recover. And so that's one of the next steps in exploring what's going on. And the last point I have on this slide, binaries and subgiants. We've done our best to make sure that we're not being contaminated by subgiants. It's possible that there is some binary contamination. This star could be a binary, for example. However, given the expected rate of binarity, you wouldn't expect all of those stars to be binaries. So I don't think that's a good explanation for what's going on. Okay, so there is this sort of mystery in the field of gyrochronology, and the K2 mission is going to provide us with some new data that might help resolve this mystery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the K2 mission now. This is the Kepler spacecraft, which for 4 years, between 2009 and 2013, just pointed at one part of the sky, searching for transiting exoplanets, and also monitoring the brightness of 150,000 stars. And it was incredibly precise, extremely precise, because its pointing precision was so incredible. However, in 2013, one of its reaction wheels broke, and it could no longer point so precisely. So the Kepler team came up with an alternative pointing strategy, and it became the K2 mission. And the K2 mission now points at fields in the ecliptic plane, because it has to keep its back to the sun so that it can balance. It uses its remaining 2 reaction wheels to control pitch and yaw, and then it fires its thrusters to control roll. And these are the new fields that K2 is going to explore. The wonderful thing about the K2 mission is that it's looking at different galactic latitudes. And in those different parts of the galaxy, there are different numbers of different types of stellar populations: thin disk, thick disk, bulge stars. So K2 will give us information about different, stellar populations and what their planetary systems in different stellar populations look like. However, for gyrochronology, it's going to be really useful for a few reasons. It's going to give us some more astroseismic targets, for one thing. But the kind of jewel in the crown of K2 for gyrochronology is the clusters. And in particular, M67 is a solar age cluster, and it's going to have photometric rotation periods for the first time ever. And we will be able to, really say, we'll be able to see whether there is some intrinsic dispersion in the relations that we weren't aware of before. And then also, kind of a neat thing that we'll be able to do with K2 is to measure rotation periods for every single star in each one of these fields. And then you can produce a distribution of stellar ages in each field. And if you can compare those stellar ages to galactic models, then you might see, you can actually calibrate gyrochronology that way. M67? Yeah.
Isn't that Kepler's huge pixels in which case how many stars can there be?
Yeah, it is actually a really difficult problem to, not only cluster memberships are difficult, but the pixels are large. So for this reason, so actually in the Kepler field, there are some old clusters. There's actually a 9 billion year old cluster in the Kepler field, but it's so hard to extract rotation periods for these stars that are reliable that it's taking a really long time to be able to get that information out of the data. So this is definitely a big data analysis problem. And there are teams working on it. I think M67 is going to be feasible. We are going to get rotation periods for M67. But that's a good point, Oh, yes? The stars in the clusters? Yes. There are definitely some astroseismic targets in the clusters, which again is going to be super useful. Okay, so K2 will give us lots of new information. But all of this new information for gyrochronology relies on us being able to measure precise and accurate rotation periods from this data. And I told you that the spacecraft's moving around a lot more than it was before, so it actually has quite a lot more noise in it. And it's not a straightforward problem to actually extract rotation periods from that data. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper I submitted earlier this year, which is called Systematics and Sensitive Periodic Signal Search with K2. So let me just, before I get into what it's all about, I want to show you this video of K2 data. The Kepler spacecraft was, sat in one position so incredibly precisely that if I were to show you a video of Kepler data, you wouldn't believe that I was showing you a movie. It would look like a still. This is a video of K2 data, and you can see that the stars are moving around on the CCD, and that's because of the motion of the spacecraft. You can also actually see that there's a fairly regular motion of the star. It kind of jerks back into the same position. That happens on a 6-hour time frame, so this is sped up, and that's a 6-hour thruster firing that appears in the data. So the effect of all of this spacecraft motion leads to light curves that look like this. So this is a typical K2 light curve, and the green is a noise model. The green line here is a noise model. So you can see this kind of choppy variability, which is caused by that 6-hour thruster firing. And then there's some long-term variability as well. So this is what our light curves now look like with K2. So we've actually got to kind of do some work to measure rotation periods with these light curves. There are two different approaches you could take here. First of all, you could say, I can model the noise using the X and Y positions of the stars on the CCD. I can model the noise, and I can subtract it out of the data, and I can search for rotation periods in the residuals. That works really, fine for exoplanet search, because exoplanet transits don't look very similar to the kind of noise that you get in the light curves. But for rotation periods, that's not ideal, because some of these trends, these systematic trends, do look kind of like rotation period signals would. So instead of fitting a noise model and detrending the data, we do everything at once. So this is work that I'm doing in collaboration with Dan Foreman-Mackey. He developed this for exoplanet searching, and then I adapted it to work with a sinusoid. So this is my signal, this is my noise, and each K2 light curve I model using both the signal and the noise. And that way I marginalize over my noise model, which completely means that I'm not going to accidentally remove signal or inject noise. Our noise model is created from, so we're using the fact that this is a rigid spacecraft. All of the stars landing on the CCD are moving around in exactly the same way. So all the information you need to know about the motion of the spacecraft is encoded in each one of those light curves. So we took the whole ensemble of K2 light curves, performed principal component analysis to decompose them into this orthogonal basis set. And then using those eigenvectors, you can reconstruct any K2 light curve that you want. And so that's exactly what we do. We fit the top, we actually use the top 150 eigenvectors. We fit them to each light curve. We're just using a linear fit, so we're just optimizing for the weights of each of those basis vectors. And we also fit a sinusoid at the same time. So this is exactly the same as like a long Scargill periodogram, a sign-fitting periodogram, except we fit the noise model at the same time. And you're marginalizing over the noise model, so you're producing these periodograms that are completely free from these systematic features. And that's why it's called the Systematic Insensitive Periodogram, or the SIP, is the acronym that we've been using. And to demonstrate that it works for stellar rotation, here's an example. So in the top panel, the gray light curve is the raw light curve. The black is the light curve conditioned on the highest amplitude sinusoid that we see. This is the SIP. So it recovers a rotation period of about 2 days for the star. You can actually see the rotation by eye. And then this is a Lom-Scargill periodogram of a detrended light curve. So you can still see that there is a little peak here around 2 days, but it's not even the second highest peak. And this is all produced by systematics. So this is the result of detrending the gray and calculating a Lom-Scargill periodogram. And this is the result of doing the whole thing in one go. Just as another example.
Just out of curiosity, what's
sure.
driving that one here? One you can see there.
Here?
Well, even the,
oh, in here? Yeah, it's just a long a longer timescale drift of the spacecraft. So over. You mean in terms of arc seconds, or?
You see the thrust, right? The
Mm-hmm.
thrust puts it in a certain period. This is
Yeah.
over days, right, or tens of days.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know that you would necessarily be able to pick everything out by eye, but there's definitely, you can see that you'd be able to fit a sinusoid to this light curve at kind of this long time scale, and that's what we're seeing in the periodogram.
But you're not sure what it is, though, what it's doing.
I'm not sure, no. So it works for rotation periods, but it works for any periodic phenomenon in K2. It works really well for asteroseismology. It works so well for asteroseismology, even better than for rotation, because asteroseismic signals really do tend to look just like sinusoids. So a sine wave is a good generative model for asteroseismology. And here's an example of an asteroseismic pulsator. So this is a red giant star. And then the top, you can see a Lomsgargle periodogram of the raw data. This peak here is that 6-hour peak. In the detrended light curve, you still see systematic features. And in the SIP, you only see the pulsations from the red giant. So this is really useful for asteroseismology as well. I'm working with Dennis Stello to produce periodograms of lots of red giant stars. Okay, so the SIP is useful for rotation, for measuring rotation periods in K2. That's what this is all about. And those rotation, yes.
How many light curves did you use to get the SVD, and how did you settle on 150 basis elements for this study?
We used all of the light curves. And 150 does sound like a number that was plucked out of the air. It's a compromise between preserving the largest amount of information and reducing computation time. Using 151 basis vectors wouldn't have gained us very much more information. And so it was really just an arbitrary choice.
You're saying you were mainly correct on those spacecraft rotations. Why do you need more than 3? Why is 150 much better than 3?
You don't have physical limitations for anything.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. The eigenlight curves cannot be interpreted as physical representations of the data.
You know, we think the number of degrees of freedom is represented in those basis elements has a rough correspondence to the number of degrees of freedom in the physical thing. It's just blended in a complicated way by the SVD. I was also surprised at 150, which is why it seems like a lot for spacecraft.
So I know that if we don't use 150, we absolutely cannot reproduce the noise in the data. And I think it's just a question of orthogonality and the level of variance.
The noise doesn't come necessarily all from the satellite. A lot of it could be stars.
But we're assuming that, yeah. Yes, we're assuming that, performing PCA is going to, unless there's a whopping great signal from one star in the data, that it won't be sensitive to individual stars.
You have like 100,000 stars or less.
20,000. Yeah.
It's not just
Yeah, it could be.
It's sort of homogeneities and other things.
Yeah.
You're modeling more than just the spectrum.
That's what Norm was saying. Maybe there's some stellar properties that are getting rolled into it.
Well, it could also be things like how the spacecraft responds to being illuminated by the sun in a particular way. If you change the thermal state of the telescope, you might change things in different ways. That could depend both on the pointing and on how long it's been pointed at the field, for example.
Yeah, the pixel sensitivities are all very different. So, yeah, it's definitely not. Stellar brightness is definitely not a linear function of x and y position. Not even close.
Can you use this technique on the calculator or the calculator? The calculator doesn't have a linear
Yeah. So with the Kepler data, the Kepler team actually produce a detrended set of light curves, and that the way they produce those is something similar to this. They just use stars that are nearby on the CCD, and they only use the top 3 or 4. I think it's 4. So for a Kepler, you don't need so many eigenvectors. Okay, I'm now going to change tack a little bit. So are there any more questions related to this part of my talk? Okay, so now I really want to talk about this a completely new method for measuring stellar rotation periods, and I'm using Gaussian processes to measure stellar rotation periods. Okay, so Gaussian processes are they are a machine learning technique. They're most often used in the machine learning literature, and in cosmology as well. And Gaussian processes essentially are useful for measuring stellar rotation periods because stellar rotation manifests itself in a light curve, typically like this. This is very typical light curve for a rotating star. It's got spots on the surface. It's got active regions which reduce the flux of the star. But those active regions are randomly distributed on the surface of the star, and it results in very non-sinusoidal variability. And this variability is also quasi-periodic because there's some differential rotation going on, spots grow and fade, and so a sine wave actually isn't a good model for stellar rotation. If we could model the light curves using a physical model, that would be great. But a lot of the parameters in physical stellar models are degenerate. So parameters like inclination and spot lifetime and amplitude, spot temperature, number of spots, all of these parameters are quite degenerate. So instead of using a physical model, we use an effective model. And a Gaussian process is a really, really good effective model for these kinds of light curves. So I've talked already about periodograms. Periodograms are very often used to measure stellar rotation periods. Even though I've been talking about how I am using a periodogram, a sign-fitting periodogram, to measure rotation periods, it's actually not the best thing that you can do. An autocorrelation function will measure a more precise rotation period than a periodogram, because an autocorrelation function doesn't care about what shape your periodic signal is, it just cares that it's periodic. So a light curve can have many peaks for one rotation period, and it can be very non-sinusoidal looking, and an autocorrelation function will still recover a precise period. The problem with autocorrelation functions is that they are not generative models of the data, so you cannot ask what is the probability of my model given my data. You cannot produce mathematically motivated uncertainties on autocorrelation function periods. A better thing to do than both of these is to use a Gaussian process model. So formally, I could spend an entire hour talking about Gaussian processes, but I'll just very kind of quickly sum them up. Formally, a Gaussian process is any process that produces a data set where the probability of obtaining that data set is an n-dimensional Gaussian, where n is the number of data points. So that is formally what a Gaussian process is. But more usefully, a way to think of a Gaussian process is you don't model your data per se, you're modeling the covariance of your data. I'll talk more on that in a second. You can also think of a Gaussian process as distribution over functions. So you're not making a decision about what your function is. You're not saying, I want to use a sinusoid or a polynomial. You're remaining completely agnostic about exactly the function that you're modeling. It's also semi-parametric, which means that it can be a distribution over functions. It can take all of these variety of shapes with only a few parameters. Okay, so really, essentially, a Gaussian process is, you should think of it as modeling the covariance between your data. So a data point over here will be tightly correlated with the data point right next to it and much less correlated with the data point over here. And that is the information that you use in order to model your data with a Gaussian process. Your covariance matrix might look a little bit like this. So data points that are close together are tightly correlated. Lighter color here means larger correlation. And data points that are far away from each other are less tightly correlated. This kind of covariance matrix will produce some stochastic variability, some smoothly varying stochastic variability. And this covariance matrix you can actually model. You can model the functional form of this covariance matrix. And that's the trick we're using here. We're saying that we can model this. And the most typical thing to use is a squared exponential covariance kernel, where the distance between your data points is modeled as a squared exponential. But what I use for stellar rotation is a little different to that. So I use a covariance kernel function to produce a covariance matrix that looks like this. This is the kind of matrix that I want for my problems, because I want a covariance matrix where my data, if they're 1 rotation period apart, they're tightly correlated. If they're 2 rotation periods apart, they're still correlated, but not quite as much. And if they're half a rotation period apart, they're not so tightly correlated. So this is exactly the kind of covariance matrix I want. And I want to be able to optimize the parameter that controls this separation here. And this is the covariance kernel function that produces this covariance matrix. This term is the squared exponential, so it controls this overall exponential decrease in correlation. And then this is the sinusoidal, this is the periodic component. And that P, that is my rotation period. This is the parameter that I'm interested in. Taking this covariance kernel function, I can optimize for P. I can marginalize over my other hyperparameters. I can perform maximum likelihood. I can sample with an MCMC. And actually, that's exactly what I do. So I use MCMC in order to recover this rotation period. To test this method, I generated hundreds of light curves using a star spot model. So these have been generated using physical models. And I attempted to recover the rotation periods of all of these hundreds of light curves that looked a bit like this. These are just a few examples. And I used the 3 different methods, Gaussian processes, and then the 2 other most commonly used methods, periodograms and autocorrelation functions. So here are the autocorrelation function results. This is measured period versus true period. And ideally, you'd want the points to lie along the 1-to-1 line, of course. And the autocorrelation function results actually lie a little bit below the line. And we know the reason for that. It's because an autocorrelation function looks like a sinusoid superimposed on a decaying exponential. So the position of the first peak in your autocorrelation function, which is what you usually measure as the rotation period, is shifted up like this, and you tend to measure a rotation period that's a little bit short. So we know the reason for this, and we can actually model it. You know, you can model the autocorrelation function with a squared exponential and a sinusoid. However, it's just something to be aware of, and I think there are quite a few literature published rotation periods that used an autocorrelation function and didn't take this effect into account. So that's just something to be aware of in general. The periodogram rotation period results look just as you'd expect. They are accurate but not very precise, and that is exactly because a sine wave isn't a good model for stellar rotation. The Gaussian process results look precise and accurate, which is exactly what you'd expect. This is a much, much better model for your stellar rotation light curve. So I've talked sort of at length about how Gaussian processes are much better than periodograms. And so there's actually no reason why you can't use a Gaussian process at the same, a Gaussian process systematics and sensitive periodogram. So we can actually use the Gaussian process for K2 data. We can also use it for Kepler data. The wonderful thing about the Gaussian process periodogram method is that you produce posterior samples for your rotation period. So they can just neatly drop into any hierarchical inference that you want to perform. Hierarchical inference is a really, really useful thing, and for gyrochronology, it's going to be key. So remember, this is the reason why we are, trying to measure these precise rotation periods. We want to solve this mystery. And using these posterior samples for rotation period, if we had posterior samples for age as well, we'd use those. They give us, the ability to model these distributions of rotation periods in a much more straightforward way. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize now. I warned you that it was going to be a talk of two halves, and so I want to bring everything back together. So the next steps really for gyrochronology are to measure rotation periods for all the Kepler and K2 stars. And we can use a Gaussian process periodogram. Gaussian processes take quite a lot of time. They're quite computationally intensive. So we might not be able to do it for all of the stars at the moment. But we can certainly measure our rotation period sensitivity. And we really need to do that in order to calibrate gyrochronology. We can use the extra information that we get from K2 then with these new rotation periods to really solve the mystery behind gyrochronology. And then, I don't know if I have very much time left, but I will just very briefly maybe talk about where I'd like to apply all of this gyrochronology. So here is the kind of galactic picture of exoplanets. Almost all the exoplanets that we know about are in this Kepler cone. So this is where the Kepler spacecraft points in the galaxy, and almost all the exoplanets that we have detected lie in this region. There are a few that lie nearby and a few microlensing planets. But K2, as I already mentioned, is going to find exoplanets in all of these brand new regions of the galaxy that we haven't found exoplanets in before. It's going to find so many exoplanets that we will be able to look into the kinds of population parameters of these exoplanets. And specifically, we'll be able to ask the question, are exoplanets more common in different parts of the galaxy? And that question is entirely bound up in age as well. So are exoplanets more common around young stars? That's what we kind of expect from dynamical simulations. We'd expect planetary systems to lose exoplanets on billion-year timescales. So if we can firmly get a grasp on gyrochronology, and I think we're really, really close, then we can start to explore how exoplanet populations evolve over time and how they look in different parts of the galaxy. So as soon as we kind of unlock this era of having precise and accurate ages for stars, this is just one of the really awesome things that I think will come out of this kind of work. So that's all I wanted to say, and thank you for your time.
Any questions?
I wonder about the age estimate from Asteroseismology, because some of the data point will be far away, but if the age there from Asteroseismology is wrong, it could explain it.
Yeah.
Where it goes into that, and also whether if we have a good gyrochronological relation, whether we could actually learn about stellar interior, because we know the age, and then we know the interior from Asteroseismology and can act this model or test models.
So your first point, it's definitely possible that the astroseismic ages are wrong. I think it's possible. When I ask astroseismologists, they absolutely disagree. They say there's no way astroseismology can be wrong. But of course, they would say that. I think I would be surprised if it was this wrong to produce this kind of effect. But we're going to, as you say, we're going to have astroseismic stars in clusters, and that will produce a pretty good calibrator for asteroseismology. It's possible. I'm not sure that it's a very strong argument for why we're seeing what we're seeing, but it's definitely a possibility. And then your second question, once we've calibrated gyrochronology, what can we then learn? So actually, we can learn about the interior of the stars, we can learn about the magnetic dynamos of the stars, but something that I'm really, really interested in applying this exact question to is what can we learn about the interactions between stars and planets? So if you know the age of a star from an isochrone fitting, maybe it's in a cluster, maybe it's an astroseismic star, if you know the age, and you can measure the rotation period, and it has a planet, does that planet transfer angular momentums to the star? Does it spin the star up? There's very, very tentative evidence for this happening with some hot Jupiters. But I would like to kind of look at an ensemble. I'd like to look at a large number of planet-hosting stars and see whether we can actually detect a significant increase in rotation period for stars that have planets versus stars that don't have planets. So that's the kind of, exactly the kind of application that I would like to use this for.
What age of evolutionary phase can you measure rotation for, i.e. how far in proportion to the main sequence phase can you measure rotation?
So you can measure definitely through the subgiant branch. I am actually not sure about red giants at all. And there is a gyrochronology, a separate gyrochronology relation for subgiants. With a subgiant, though, if you know that it's a subgiant, and you can measure its rotation period, you can measure its age really precisely. So this works with subgiants really well. Again, once we kind of calibrate gyrochronology, you can use rotation period to even establish whether a star is a main sequence star or not.
For the gyrochronology, you essentially assume the specific parameterization for the relation between age, rotation period, and color.
Yes.
And then you look at the posterior of these parameters.
Yes.
What's the motivation for this particular parameterization? And have you thought about maybe using Gaussian processes to model this relation as well?
So this relation was first sort of adopted by Sidney Barnes in 2003. He also coined the term gyrochronology. And it's a simple model that seems to describe the data quite well. I think it's time to move to a different, probably a different relation now that we're seeing that this discrepancy and this model actually can't capture all of the information that we're seeing. A Gaussian process wouldn't be the right thing to use in this case, because a Gaussian process is a great model for some kind of stochastic process. But if you want to calibrate a model which you then want to go and apply to something else, because Gaussian processes are stochastic, you can't use a Gaussian process to do that. So say you want to fit a say you want to fit a straight line to data. You're better using an actual model to do that.
But in this case, I don't know that it's a straight line, right?
Yeah.
It's just a different way of saying I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So this kind of problem isn't well described by Gaussian process. You can use Gaussian processes for things like modeling correlated noise, but if you want a physical understanding of the process that's going on, or an empirical understanding of the process that's going on, you still need to use a mean model. For stellar rotation, my mean model is a straight line. It's 0, just a straight line, because that is a good mean model for stellar rotation. For this problem, a good mean model is something like the model that I'm using. And a Gaussian process will tell you about any additional correlated noise on top of that. But I need the mean model to tell me about what's going on underneath. We can talk more about it later if you're interested. A better model for gyrochronology would be some functional form plus a mixture model to account for outliers. And we actually do use a mixture model in our analysis.
Just a short question. I mean, you mentioned this paper using autocorrelation to measure rotation periods on half the field, and they measure a large number of stars.
Yeah.
So what that information can be used to, in some way, to understand the spin-down physics, or understand, if you know, for example, if you know the age spread of the stars,
yeah.
You also know the rotation spread of the stars, in principle you can understand
Yeah, so this is, I did touch on this a little bit. So this is actually something exactly what I want to do. I want to measure rotation periods for all the stars in Kepler. There are lots of rotation periods already for Kepler stars that have been measured using the autocorrelation function method. With a method like the Gaussian process method, you don't need to say, this is, I've definitely detected a rotation period on this star, and I definitely haven't on this star. With the autocorrelation function method, you kind of have to do that. But anyway, that's a slightly separate point. I want to do exactly that. So measure rotation periods for all of the stars in the Kepler field, get an age distribution using a gyrochronology relation, compare that age distribution from a prediction to a prediction from a galactic model, and then use that to calibrate the gyrochronology relation. So that's exactly what I want to do. And with K2, we'll sample lots of different parts of the galaxy, and we'll be able to really constrain gyrochronology using that method.
Okay.